Hi, Brad.
Hi,
Thank you so
Makenzie.
much for being here with me today.
Good to be with you. You're very
It's an
special, you
honor.
know.
Thank you for saying that. You are special to me in my life specifically. And I'm honestly like shook is the word that I could probably use. I feel like a child, like I'm nervous, like to even be talking to you, but like very excited. So thank you for
Well,
giving
we're
me the
also
time.
dear friends, so let it go.
Thank you. So this podcast is kind of formed, it was birthed from this place of my human experience and my divine experience and trying to figure out how to marry those things. So that's been my whole life, right? But I feel like consciously over the last 4 years, that's been my life. Like before, I was just kind of floating in the ocean of what is this? I'm a human and I knew there was a divine element and I was trying to figure that out, which landed me in the Christian church, which was my faith and my religion, and took me down a long road of ministry. And then about 4 years ago, I felt like the structure of that kind of fell away. And that's what brought me to you, actually, to your book, A More Christ-Like God. And that book was a catalyst for me into seeing God in a different way. And as my life was crumbling apart, it validated the relationship that I felt like I had with this beautiful God that loved me. And so then as that structure continued to kind of just like peel back layers, I found myself in a position of being consciously aware that I am on a journey of like the human and the divine. And I'm genuinely trying to live the experience of my own story, but also learn from the experiences of others. And through that process, I kind of went through this tremendous deconstruction that I felt like happened to me. I didn't feel like I had a way out of it. And multiple times found myself being like, man, ignorance really is bliss. I wish I could just go back to the way that I used to believe and just, take it for what it is. But here I am, right? So then there was a different experience of floating out in the ocean, but aware that there was something that I had to figure out within myself. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today is the deconstruction process. And I know that a lot of people who come from religious backgrounds of all kinds go through those experiences. It looks different for everybody. And I want to talk to you about whether or not you've had those experiences, what that's looked like for you, and what your heart says about them.
Yeah, well, for sure. In fact, you've already described the voluntary and involuntary aspects of it. That's something I think is important for people to know about, because sometimes on social media, you get these cheerleaders who are just like, yeah, you're deconstructing. This is wonderful. Just go for it. And it's almost like a toxic positivity for those who've undergone deconstruction as trauma. So I want to those who've experienced it as something they didn't choose and even experienced it as trauma, I want to be super empathetic. And so to put myself in their shoes, and I have been in those shoes, we'll get to that in a moment, but it can feel like the positivity is sort of like someone who thinks you're in a gym and you're trying to bench press and they're going, yes, you could do it. You could do it. It's like, I'm not bench pressing. I'm under a steamroller. Stop it. You're hurting me more,
Yes.
Or let's say if the deconstruction it may be more voluntary, but it's like absolutely necessary, because let's say you've been in a toxic environment and, for example, where some of what was taught or you engaged in was like almost like a cancer. Let's say the angry God who hates you, that you need to perform well enough or he'll burn you in hell forever. That's so toxic that you're like, I have to leave that. I don't have a choice for my mental, emotional, spiritual health. I've got to go. That's still traumatic because you're losing community. You're losing the affirmation that you had from those when you were being a good girl or whatever, right? But here's the problem too, is that even though it's a cancer that had to go, it can also be like a mastectomy. Someone who's had a radical mastectomy doesn't get to choose how much of their selves they lose, right? Like You lose the
Yeah.
cancer, but maybe you lose like your breasts and and what's under your arms and all, well, spiritually speaking, that I run into this a lot. I get direct messages from people all the time who are like, I knew I had to let go of my toxic church environment, but I didn't want to let go of Jesus. And now I feel like I've lost Jesus. And now I feel like I've lost all faith. Oh no, I've even feel like I've lost myself. And so some of these messages I'm getting from psych wards.
Wow.
And so that would be an example of them not getting to choose what they lost once the ball got rolling, kind of thing. And so I want to just be very empathetic to those folks for sure. The other side of it is, and you've experienced this, that sometimes in deconstruction, it can also be very liberating. And it's like a bird finally getting out of a cage and flying, right? And
Yeah.
it's like when you're getting in touch with your singing voice and the spontaneous words that just start coming out of your mouth and the sounds, and you're like, oh my goodness, I never knew it could be this good. And then someone like me comes along and says, look at, and God doesn't hate you after all. And he's not threatening you with a fiery furnace forever. And 1,000 pounds comes off your shoulders, right? So we just want to acknowledge, first of all, that we have that full range of experiences.
Yeah.
I'll pause there before I share any of my story about that, in case you want to jump in and respond or say some things.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like I said, mine felt really traumatic. And then at this point in my life, it feels like we're transitioning into more of that liberating feeling, which I'm grateful for. But I'm also grateful for, in some ways, for the understanding of the traumatic element, because it's true that we can skip over that and not realize, people can look at it and be like, oh, we're free. Well, yeah, but like you said, we sometimes go through the process of loss, or we're like, oh, we're just not going to take this thing anymore. But with that thing goes our entire identity as we knew it. And then we're left with, what are we now? Right. And with me, I did experience that. I was like, well, I'm not throwing Jesus away. I'm just leaving these elements. But somehow when that divorce happened inside of me, I didn't know how to keep Jesus, because my brain was so conditioned in this view of who Jesus was and what it meant to follow him or love him, that I was like, how do I figure out what's okay to let go of? And then there was an element of feeling almost like I was Adam and Eve in the garden hiding, where I was just so ashamed of even the questions that I had. And I found myself at the end of the day, because at the beginning of the deconstruction process, I would look at people and say, listen, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I still love Jesus. I'm just leaving these elements. And they would say to me, that's a slippery slope, Makenzie, right? So then I'm sitting by myself, just weeping in my room. And I'm like, this is the slippery slope they were talking about. Like, everyone was right. I thought that I wouldn't lose Jesus, but I am lost, is how I felt. And then someone like you did come along, and you've been a huge help in this process for me. And even now I find myself having questions like, it's like it's ingrained in you somewhere, right? It takes a while for those things to fully move through your system, to actually live in the experience of freedom and be like, wow, God really is this good. And I really am just loved. And I really am okay, So even now I find that sometimes I'll go back to this place of being like, is this okay? But the slippery slope element is what came to my mind, because no one realizes that when you're breaking away from systems and structures, that there's still this child inside of you that's looking for someone to tell you that you're all right. And a lot of times we don't have that. We don't have anyone telling us that we're all right. Sometimes it really is just us alone in our rooms trying to figure it out. But the beautiful part is that as I've kind of continued along this path and as it's unfolded itself, like it's kind of the unfolding is happening, I'm finding more and more liberation and freedom, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, it's interesting that those who are most concerned about the slippery slope on your behalf, let's say they watch you slipping away, they don't seem aware of the ancient Christian tradition, which was all about this. Like, so I'll teach you a new word, apophatic theology. Apophatic theology goes all the way back even to the Old Testament prophets, the New Testament, and the early church Christians. And what it said was this, that whatever we say about God, whatever conception we hold of God, whatever systems we create around of God, all of that can just be idols. And so they were always pushing against that, so much so that other religions thought that Jews and Christians were atheists. Because like Jews would not be allowed to have an idol, right? So their entire idea of God was divorced from these idols of stone and gold and so on. And whenever they were tempted with that, they really were tempted. Well, we need that. We need something to anchor to. They created idols, and those idols were usually mean and so on. Well, then the early Christians come along and they go, you could have this same kind of idol even in your head, a concept of God that's actually quite monstrous. And that's even an idol. So they would pray these crazy prayers like, God, deliver me from God. And what they meant was, deliver me from every idea of God that I've set up as an idol. Now, the paradox in Christianity is that it comes along and it says, actually, we do have an image of God. And that image is profound because it's the image of God in Christ, where we can understand a God who knows our wounds. And so for me, part of this thing has been like, first of all, I got to get rid of all these idolatrous notions that I actually developed in church. Well, that's not a slippery slope. That's repentance, right? But then at the same time, then in the deconstruction process, as you're getting rid of all these husks, then you're like, well, but then what do I do with Jesus, right? And so where I came to it was this. A lot of my friends they're still experiencing the allergies towards religiosity. So they want to just they don't even want to use the word God. They'll say like the universe or something. It's like the universe loves me. It's like, well, I get why you have to do that, because the word God or even Jesus can become an idol. But the universe doesn't love you. Watch the weather tonight. Step off a cliff sometime. Tell me how the universe loves you, right? But what happens is, for somebody like the disciple Thomas, he doesn't actually fall in love with God because he's seen this glowing light or this ethereal divine nature out there or whatever. It's like he sees the wounds. And so I don't expect all of your listeners to connect with this, but for me, what happened is this. Jesus plays into it because in him, I see a God who bears my wounds. In his hands, I see the wounds I've inflicted on other people. And I see the wounds that have been inflicted on me. And I go, oh, whatever God is, this God knows what wounds are and has willingly united himself to my wounding. So to me, that's why I'm still a Christian. But I'm a Christian agnostic in the sense of there's so much of this. It's a mystery. It's really okay to have a paradox. You don't have to figure it all out. You can go, whatever God is, I know this God loves me, even down to my wounds. And I have a picture of it that looks like a cross. And rather than having a theology that's an idol. So anyway, I wanted to affirm your slippery slope. Some of that is actually towards a more ancient version of Christianity that's not fundamentalist at all.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I guess what my personal experience brought me was a lot of persecution, right? A lot of, what's a better word? I lost the trust element in a lot of my relationships is what it felt like to me, that people stopped trusting me. People stopped, their view of me and who I was to my core changed, it shifted. And I was seeing that even friendships, familial relationships, just my reputation in general as a human being, it started to be like, the way it felt to me was that there was whispering going on, right? Like Makenzie, right? She's like lost it. And a lot
Pray
of that,
for her.
but at the same time, I was like in ministry and I came home and was like, guess what? I'm not a Christian like that anymore, I guess. And then got a divorce. And then I'm a single mom of 2 kids. And on paper, it's like, pray for her, like something's wrong. And there was a lot wrong. I mean, there was a lot wrong in my life. But as I've like gone on this process of just, like I said, it's almost, I didn't choose it, it chose me, right? Like I can't go back. There was no going back from me to the old way of believing. So I had to just let those losses happen. And even if it wasn't loss in the way that these people don't exist in my life anymore, it's the quiet concern and that feeling of like, how are you doing? And what's underneath that feels a lot like judgment, whether it's perceived or real. It felt that way to me. That has made me question a lot how the church treats deconstruction.
Yeah, it's very alienating, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to know, I guess, what do you say to people who are going through those losses? It's a death. I mean, it is a death, and it's a lonely one a lot of the time, right? I would say most of the time, and it makes you question, I guess, even the trust that you have with yourself. Like, Can I even trust myself to deconstruct and to have these questions? And then when you are vulnerable and you come to like leaders of the church or people who have been in authority over you or whatever it is with these questions, which was my experience, it was met with almost like a fear. They were afraid of me and for me. What do you say to people who are going through those experiences and are losing, but feel like they have no choice?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I would hope that we can come through that liminal space where from community, because it feels like we're coming out of community or pseudo community. No, let's even be more positive, like coming out of real relationships and community. But then we if they are not affirming of our journey, we do end up feeling alienated and isolated. But you have just said, like, you can't back your way back into that. So what's the way forward? Well, this might be specific to particular people in the Enneagram. I don't know, but here's what worked for me. Well, first of all, on some of my deconstruction, the negative part, the very traumatizing part, was around personal meltdown and around loved ones dying in very tragic ways and so on. But on the theological side, my questioning belief and so on, I happened to have a community that was into it. Like, they were really for me. So that's one thing. But then the haters started coming out, like aggressively, systematically. I used to do a lot of itinerant ministry. And so there would be people tracking my schedule and calling ahead to everywhere I went to get them to cancel me. And they'd say, you've got a false teacher coming in. You haven't done your homework. Why would you lead your people into this stuff? You should look at these websites about him, which they had created. So, I mean, I'm like, okay, how do I not let this kind of thing get into my heart when some of those places where I thought the people knew me were canceling me?
Yeah.
I'm like, you know me though. And they're like, well, and it was the same thing you're saying. They were afraid of me and for me. So what do we say to them? Well, I discovered that if I had even 2 or 3 people who I really respected and wanted to be like, if I could count on them to put their arm around me and to say, you're okay, you are on track, it's okay. And then I'm like, okay, I trust them. And I would insist to them, and they were these type of people anyway. It's why I did trust them, is that if I was off track, they would tell me. And they're like, no, I think you're losing it on this one, Brad. It's like, well, if you say so, that's probably true. But they have zero agenda for anything but to actually love me. And so when they're saying like, no, carry on, we're with you, I only needed a little posse of those, and they just erased 1,000 haters' voices.
Yeah.
And so in my case, remember Eugene Peterson? He did the Message Bible.
Yes.
He was one of these guys. So I looked up to him. I wanted to be more like him. He's a very kind man. Or like Richard Rohr now. very loving man, very embracing, very Christ-like. And so it helped that they had silver hair, of experience, and them just saying, no, you're on the right track. Well, then all the other voices come along and I can say, well, who the hell are you?
Yeah.
Eugene loves me.
Yeah.
Roar affirms, so in a case like that, then, you know me a little bit, and I'm saying it's really okay, Makenzie. In fact, you're not just going down the slippery slope. The life is a slippery slope. Life is a slippery slope, and you're doing really well. You don't have to have a particular theology of Jesus to experience the love of God, but I will remind you of Jesus because he knows your wounds. He knows your wounds. So, like, maybe it helps you to know someone like me who's going, you are not crazy. You don't even have a choice half the time. It's just you're swimming, and some days it feels like you're going to drown, but you haven't drowned. Wow.
Yeah.
Good.
And that is my experience. My experience is that God has given me these people along the way, like you, and it's been very few who, in the same ways, it's like, that is the anchor for me, as I feel like I'm starting to, my eyes turn toward the crowds of people who are, the judgment is like fire, right? And it's in front of me because it's close to me. And I can live in that and get caught up in that. And then the shift goes to where the support and the love is, right? And that reminds me of Jesus, right? Because never have I ever felt not supported and not loved by Jesus. So
well, there you go.
The reminder is in the experience of these relationships. And I'm like, which one looks like him?
Wow,
right?
That's good. Yep.
Yeah. And so that's what it's been for me. And I wonder often now, I think a lot about the fear, the external fear that I experienced in the church, like specifically in ministries that I worked in, right, with my questions, because I have identified with Thomas, as you were speaking about earlier, quite often, like just as a Christian in general. I'm like, man, that's me, right? So I would come though with my questions and I'd be like, hey, like I'm not really sure about this, or this is how I'm feeling, or whatever, right? Whatever it may be. And experiencing that fear, something that would always come up in me was this thought, there's no fear in love. And I never really fully understood why that would, every time I would have these experiences, it would be like the thought, and it would give me some sort of comfort, but I never dove into it, but I'm wondering also, why do you feel the church is so afraid of questions, not in general, but for people who are experiencing pushback or judgment from their families who, like we said, are afraid for them, and of them. Why are they so afraid?
Yeah, I mean, some of it almost feels like an addiction to fear. And part of it is they used fear for so long to control people that they actually fell for that themselves.
Yeah.
I would like to say, like, some of this comes from bad theology from 500 years ago, but it's not just the church, there's something in human nature. So if we go back to the Adam and Eve story, what I find really interesting is, like, God loved Adam and Eve in this, which is an archetype of our lives, really. And God had never done anything to indicate that he's a punisher or she's a punisher, that there was no indication of retribution. It's like the very first command was, eat all of this stuff. Oh, by the way, there's one poison tree, so stay away from that. So it's this warning, right? But what happens is, as Adam and Eve take the fruit, it's a stumble. It's an inevitable stumble. And what happens is, the moment they stumble, they feel shame. Out of their shame, they create an image of God that they need to be afraid of, and then they go hide. So I wonder if some of it is in the church, where we just see sort of a collective shame that creates a retributive image of God that we're so afraid of. And then but the story of the scriptures is that God comes looking for them. They leave the garden and God goes with them. And then you were actually citing 1 John 4, which is probably the most mature theology in the Bible of this whole journey, which is that there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who is afraid has not yet been perfected in love. Wow, if the church would just meditate on that paragraph for 100 years, it might purge some of the fear that grows out of the false image of God, that grows out of our own shame, that comes out of inevitably stumbling. Of course we do.
Yeah.
So one other example, Romans. I learned Romans 3:23, like, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Like that tone with the finger.
Same.
Let me give it to you in another tone and finish the verse, by the way. It is, everyone sins, but God has freely given us his grace. That's actually what Paul says. How we turn that into this finger wagging thing, I guess it's rooted in us from childhood. I'll just give an example. When I was a little kid, my mom pointed to the hot stove. She said, "Don't touch the hot stove, it'll burn you." I inferred that when the redness of the element went away, that it wouldn't be hot anymore. So I touched the stove and I burnt myself. And what did I do? I went and hid. And I made the burn much deeper because of that. Instead of running to my mom, who had done nothing to say, like, if you touch the stove, I will burn you. Yeah. But that's the kind of God we have believed in. And so deconstruct that all you like. That's not a slippery slope. That, like I said, that's repentance. That's getting back to the heart of the matter.
It's this whole, like, everything in the past 5 minutes has been making me so emotional. And I think it's because I'm suddenly realizing this overlap in my relationships with other human beings and my relationship with God. It's not that I've never realized that before, but I'm starting to, like, be aware in my own life that when I feel like I've messed something up, right? Or I feel like I've done something wrong, or I've hurt someone's feelings in any relationship, my motherhood, my friendships, all of them, right? There's this wall that kind of just shoots up inside of me, and emotionally I shut down, and it's like my brain goes, it's like, we're done and we live inside of us now, and you can't do relationships, clearly you're a failure, because you continue to fail. And it's this shame, like the shame is just so thick that, like, I'll find myself just, like, staring out of a window because I can't look in the face of the person that I'm having conflict, or that I feel like I've failed in some way, or anything, right? I feel this, like, I need to just deflect and look away. And it's now having this conversation with you, it's retribution is so ingrained in my body, because it's what I've believed about God my whole life. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's now being played out like in the movie of my life, that this is how everyone is, right? Like we can't run to the arms of the person that we love because we're so filled with shame.
Right. So we project it on them, even if if their arms are open.
Exactly. Right. But all you can see, at least me, like personally, all I can see is the failure and the projection of what I feel will happen, right? Or how I'll be received. And you create that in your mind and you run away. Yeah. And what I'm learning is to stay open.